After having decided that alchemy could be the theme of this year's festival, we started researching the subject to see where, outside of Harry Potter and Philosopher's Stone, we could potentially find any relevant media objects that could help us explore the subject together with the audience. When in doubt, you ask Uncle Google, and so did we. We rushed into the search engine and typed a very sophisticated phrase. Then we dug into the most obscure of internet sources and scrolled down to the relevant section. We expected to find references to gothic horror classics like Elias Merhige, Kenneth Anger, and some obscure occult experimental films, but what we certainly did not expect was the eponymous Dutch classic, the movie that, at least for a part of Imagine Team, could be considered one of the most accomplished films in Dutch cinema history, Spoorloos. We quickly checked the attribution of the quote, found the relevant book, and got blown away by the interpretation of George Sluizer's classic provided by the Cornell University scholar Karen Pincus. Following Karen's narrative, we went deep into the rabbit hole and came out the other end convinced that Spoorloos is, indeed, a modern alchemical treatise. So, we wanted to invite all of you in this room to a collective experiment and see that timeless classic as a figure of alchemical marriage and an alchemical opus magnum of a madman who decided to merge femininity and masculinity in the most gruesome of alchemical experiments. The full discussion of different layers of Spoorloos can be followed in the first episode of our Imagine podcast. Before that happens though, let us provide you with a teaser, a bit of a tip of the iceberg, and an open invitation to explore further. To get digital copies of the film, pause, freeze, rewind, and check the frames against the most famous alchemical works, which can be found in the Amsterdam-based Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica. Now, let's briefly follow some of the arguments discussed by Karen and juxtapose them with the images from the film. As we read in Karen's book, in 1988 Dutch film The Vanishing, a young couple goes on a summer road trip to Boisview, an old woods and alchemical location par excellence in south of France. As the film opens, Rex Hoffman is driving while Saskia applies her makeup in the rearview mirror. If we stop here for a moment, we will notice the name of the main protagonist is Rex, which actually means king in Latin. One of the most important alchemical figures is so-called chemical wedding, which portrays the union of a red king and white queen. The red king is sulfur, while white queen is mercury. They are alchemical allegories, and their union represents the process of uniting opposites to create a greater, fully unified product of that union. The king and the queen become one in the process, a hermaphrodite. But because they do represent the opposites, they need to undergo a process of transmutation first, which is often understood as death. In order to change something into something else, we need to sometimes disintegrate it first, and the first stage of the alchemical process, therefore, is nigredo, and it represents decomposition. Karen writes, after a brief quasi-flirtatious squabble, Rex and Saskia enter a long tunnel. Saskia's mood turns dark, and she relates to a recurring nightmare in which she is trapped inside a golden egg, floating through space. Or rather, as she corrects herself, the last time she had the dream, there was another person trapped in another vase, but the two eggs could never meet or they would rupture. Just then, the car runs out of gas, the couple is trapped in the tunnel, and the twin lights of an oncoming truck strike Saskia as a foreboding representation of the frightening double eggs in her dream. Terrified, Rex and Saskia argue and he storms off to get gas, leaving her alone in the tunnel. The ambivalent scene figures dualities of light and dark, male and female. First of all, Spoorloos is based on a book by Tim Krabbe called Golden Egg, and as we read in the interpretation of Carl Gustav Jung, in alchemy, the egg stands for the chaos apprehended by the artifacts, the prima materia containing the captive world soul. Out of the egg, symbolized by the round cooking vessel, will rise the eagle or phoenix, the liberated soul, which is ultimately identical with the anthropos who was imprisoned in the embrace of physis. To put it bluntly, the stake of alchemy is to bring together the opposites, to overcome the ambivalence through transmutation, but it does not happen by itself. The king and the queen are thus accompanied by a dove, which acts as a mediator between the two opposites, the agent that will make the union happen, therefore the alchemist. His role is to free the soul from its physical constraints and make it achieve its final form through synthesis. Now, let's look at Raymond Lamorne, the spiritus movens of the film, the one whose great work, the great design, will be to bring Rex and Saskia together as one in the ultimate process of transmutation and synthesis. In flashbacks, we see Raymond, who is a chemistry professor, preparing drafts of ether in the shed of the country home, a makeshift laboratory that seems a throwback to earlier times, filled as it is with antique containers and apparatuses. At some point, the film gives a kind of etiology for what the professor terms a slight abnormality of his personality. We see him as a boy seated on a chair on a small balcony overlooking a town square. He opens a copy of Mutus Liber, one of the most famous works of alchemy, which was the main source of inspiration for Carl Gustav Jung in his interpretation of the alchemy. The viewer probably has no chance to register the title without a pause button, so let's watch it in slow motion. The book opens on an image of a ladder. Next, the boy runs his fingers along an image of a couple holding a glass vessel between them. The vessel contains a homunculus, an artificial offspring, which is not a product of procreation but alchemy. The union between the man and the woman, thus, is brought by artificial means. The book is without text, as mutus in Latin means mute, silent, and it is the book that requires empirical understanding. As with everything in alchemy, it is not enough to understand it, you need to dare to experiment, to practice. And so the boy soon loses interest, or perhaps he is inspired by the book, and he climbs out onto the balcony ledge and jumps. We noted a washing service just below the apartment, a blancherie, which stands for the place of whitening, which is the literal name of the second of alchemical stages, albedo, the purification. Concerned with bringing light and clarity to the prima materia, it brings our alchemist a clarity about his purpose and the methods. The whole back and forth between Raymond and Rex throughout the movie is an equivalent or the first stage of the alchemical process, citrinitas, which is about drawing in of the solar light, casting the light on the matter that has previously been obscured. In Jung's interpretation, this would actually be a figure of the psychoanalysis itself. The movie keeps bringing back science as a boomerang, with the couple burying the gold under the tree, Raymond and Rex discussing how surnames of people getting married conflate and create new meanings.
J'ai un voisin, son chien s'appelle Rex. Dodeman. Madame Homme Mort. Je connais un. Et le mariage, ça donne des combinaisons étranges. Je connais une femme qui s'appelle Fula hors du lit. Gooi er van bed af. Van bed af.
We're confronted with the recurring figure of a circle, with car lights, bicycle wheels, and many, many more objects. And finally, on the way to their final destination, the men stop at the memorial, which is encrusted in gold. Finally, the last stage, which those who have seen Spoorloos know, is rubedo, the synthesis, the coming together. And without spoiling it too much, we can only say that some of the most known depictions of chemical wedding are those portraying the king and the queen together on a catafalque or in grave. The new can only be born if we let go of the old. And as such, the great work of Raymond, the Magnum Opus, perhaps can come to fruition, making him the alchemist. With these few examples, we barely scratched the surface, but we hope we will get you to activate your detective skills and help us transform Spoorloos into an alchemical treatise through the power of reinterpretation.